So we have stem root here. They have different colored labels, or different colored caps, sorry. And also the powder is different color, which you'll see later. There's gray, yellow, and pink, right? And so stem root number 1 has 0.1% of IBA, which is the active ingredient, indo-butyric acid. Stem root number 2 has 0.4% IBA, indo-butyric acid. And stem root number 3 has 0.8% IBA, indo-butyric acid. And the reason that there's 3 different strengths of this is that you don't want the plant to get more of this hormone than it needs, because again, it creates havoc. And it's kind of like our bodies in that if the plant can sense that there's enough hormone in its system, it won't produce any of its own. And its own hormones, quite frankly, are more effective in producing cambial and meristematic tissue. The only thing is the plant is temporarily in shock when you cut it. So what happens is it temporarily, its ability to produce this and translocate this IVA, especially translocate it, is really low because it's in shock. And so what this does is it's just meant to be a kick-starter. It's not meant to take over the entire function of the rooting process, because the plant can do it more effectively. So you don't want to give it too much.
So is the active ingredient in that, is it plant-based or is it synthetically produced?
I believe it's synthetically produced.
And what would you say about using that in terms of...
I don't believe it's banned in organic standards. If anything, I would worry about the talc more than the IBA.
Yep, fair enough.
Because the talc is often associated with asbestos. You know, you shouldn't be breathing this stuff, basically. But you use it in such small quantities, and there's such 0.1% is very small. So I personally wouldn't worry about it. If you are worried about it, or if it later on becomes an issue that becomes obvious that it's not good, the willow water helps. The other thing that helps is kelp liquid or kelp powder, because kelp, as you might know, is one of the fastest growing plants in the world. It'll grow feet every day. Bamboo is very similar as well. And so what kelp has is hormones in it that will stimulate both root initiation and root elongation, which is what you want. So that is also another alternative. The thing that you want, though, is you want to get it calloused and rooted as quickly as possible. And it's just like a cut in your skin. The longer it stays open, the more likely you're going to get an infection. And you don't want these little baby cuttings to get infected. So that's where this helps. So we have these 3 strengths. So why would you, or how would you know what one to use?
Yeah, that's what I'd like to know.
Okay. So the less bark a plant has, the less rooting hormone it needs. Because plants, just like humans, reproduce easier when they're younger. It gets harder to reproduce to the point of impossible as people age, and it's also true with plants. If you have a very old plant, you take a cutting from it, you know, and lots of times I get these requests, they say, oh, I've got a beautiful 50-foot wisteria. Can I, would you take a cutting for me because it's such a beautiful plant? Well, I say yes, if you will allow me to cut it down to the ground, and then when it shoots out new growth, that new growth will be juvenile growth. And they go, oh, that's not what I had in mind. But that is one way to revert a plant that is very mature back to juvenile, is by just basically being brutal and cutting it right back. And many nurseries will do that. As their plants age, they'll just cut them right to the ground, and then the new growth that comes out is once again more physiologically able to reproduce. So with number one, we probably, I don't even, maybe we could use it on this green Pieris. We'll try some with this and some otherwise. But if it doesn't have any bark at all, so one would be, you would use this for your house plants that don't get bark. So let's say your philodendrons or your spider plants.
Or Dieffenbachia.
Dieffenbachia, yeah. Yeah, you would use it on that. Geraniums, poinsettias, anything that doesn't have bark and probably will never get bark, or not until it's very, very old will it get bark. That's what you use number one for. Number two, and that's called a softwood or a herbaceous cutting. Okay? So number two is used for what they call semi-hardwood cuttings. And semi-hardwood cuttings, what will happen as this plant grows is that it'll start out being very green and lush, and then as time goes on and it gets more mature, it will start to get more and more bark. Because this Pieris eventually will have bark. So rooting powder number two is used on plants that will get bark, but they might not be fully covered with bark yet. You don't want to use it on the green part of this because that's too juvenile, but there is a part, and you can sort of see there's sort of stripes, and I'll pass it around, where you can sort of see and feel that the bark is starting to form on the very bottom of this.
So like arbutus would be similar, the arbutus shoot.
Arbutus shoots would be similar. As a general rule, trees are always more difficult to take cuttings from than shrubs. And shrubs are more difficult to take cuttings from than herbaceous plants. So trees take a lot to get them to root, a lot of time, and many times disease will set in before the tree will actually root.
In spring, would you be able, like that, when you were saying that 50-year-old giant tree, if you were to, in spring, crawl up into the tree and find one of those new growths that come in spring, would you be able to root one of those?
That would be your best chance.
Okay.
But the plant in its entirety would still be very overly mature.
Okay.
So, and that depends. Different plants will age, will revert to beyond reproductive age at different points in their life.
Okay.
But I mean, that's your best chance,
Okay.
for sure.
So my mother-in-law has a plum tree that has these beautiful golden plums, and it seems to put shoots out from the base every year. That's something that you could effectively take a cutting
from. The base, it depends on the plum tree.
Right.
Unfortunately, what can happen is that many of the plum trees are grafted onto a rootstock.
Right.
And so if those shoots are coming out from below the graft,
Right.
you're not going to get the same tree that's up top.
That
you're
makes
going to get
sense,
the
yeah.
rootstock. And it might be
Interesting.
vigorous, but there's some reason they're using it for a rootstock rather than a top. So it might be very vigorous, it might be resistant to wet soils, it might be dwarfing, it might actually keep the plant small. The rootstocks are used for a bunch of different reasons. So, but generally, if it produced really beautiful flowers, it wouldn't be used for a rootstock, it'd be just used for the whole plant. So
Okay.
your chances of that are very slim,
Okay.
you know, of getting the same plant. You might get a nice plant, but it won't be the same plant. So, and then number three is a whole other story. Number three rooting powder is for cuttings that are still dormant. So this is the strongest rooting powder, and it will take the longest. The cutting that is dormant needs the strongest rooting powder and also the longest time to root.
Lavender.
It will depend on lavender, because lavender you can take at 3 different stages, and many plants you can take at 3 different stages. You can take the lavender when it's dormant, in the winter when it's not growing and it's just dormant, it's not putting out any new growth. When it's dormant, you would use number 3 because it's not actively translocating a bunch of hormones.
It's sleepy right now.
It's sleeping, yeah, yeah.
It's still sleepy.
Yeah, and then when you see the new growth starting to come,
Then you go to 2.
well, then you go to 1 with the new growth.
Right, okay.
So what will happen is a plant will be dormant, and then it'll come awake. It'll put on a bunch of green, lush growth in some cases. Some plants, like this one, is a deciduous azalea, and what this will do is it'll actually probably have a flower before it has leaves. But one way or another, it'll either put out leaves or it'll put out flowers and leaves, and then after that's over, you'll put out new growth. And that growth will be green and lush and soft. And so that's the stage where you use your number 1 powder, because it's green and lush and doesn't have any bark on it.
Okay.
So with the lavender, that's the stage you could do lavender, is when it's green and lush. And then over time, that green lush growth starts to harden off, starts to get bark. And that's when you use the number 2. And that's the semi-hardwood cutting. This is a hardwood or a dormant cutting. So there's softwood, semi-hardwood, hardwood cuttings based on how much bark is on the cutting itself. Now, some plants, this is where it gets tricky, is that some plants just will not come from one type of cutting or the other. Like you can't necessarily do a softwood, semi-hardwood, or hardwood cutting off certain plants just because they're in that stage of growth. You know, well, you might get success, like 1% success or something, you know, so you do 100 cuttings, you might get 1, you might fluke 1. But, and that's where it really takes looking up on the internet or finding a good book and having that good book say, best taken from hardwood cuttings, best taken from semi-hardwood cuttings, best taken from softwood cuttings. So it does require a little bit of research to know this particular plant, how is it going to be best propagated. Because people are working on this all the time in the nursery industry. There's a really good book by Michael Durr called Plant Propagation that is the Bible of nursery propagators. Michael Durr, he's amazing. And he has propagated virtually every plant I can think of, and probably more that I don't know about.
Can you think of an example of one that can only be propagated in its hardwood, like dormant stage?
Grapes are actually best propagated from hardwood.
Yes, they're hard to propagate.
Yeah, well, not from hardwood cuttings. They're easy to propagate from hardwood cuttings. And the problem with some softwood cuttings is that the material is just so soft that it wilts really easily.
Yeah, because it can't hold its water in.
It can't hold its water, and you cut it and it doesn't have a lot of stiffness in its tissue, and so once it wilts, it bends over and it pinches that vascular system where the water flows up, and then it doesn't have enough strength, water pressure to straighten that cutting out again, because it just can't, it doesn't transpire because it's not photosynthesizing, so it can't pull up water. So when you keep like we're going to stick these cuttings in this soil, we're going to wet them down really well, but really that wetness is only to keep the humidity high because the plant is not going to effectively take up the water. it might take up a little bit, but it's not gonna be really effective. It's not gonna take up as much as it needs. So grapes are one that come better from hardwood cuttings. Lilacs will only come from very soft cuttings or root cuttings, which is a whole other thing that we'll talk about some other time.
We tried to go through those too.
Yeah, they also send suckers, so that's another way to
Yeah.
propagate lilacs. That's easy,
Yeah,
right?
it doesn't
That's
work.
kind of like root cuttings. But, you know, they'll only come from very soft cuttings. And again, the trouble with soft cuttings is you really have to maintain the humidity almost perfectly. Like, it's almost impossible for the average person to maintain ideal humidity and light conditions and all that sort of thing to root really, really soft cuttings. So really soft cuttings, if they're going to root, they don't take as long to root. But if they're soft cuttings of plants that eventually get bark, they might be harder to root because until they get bark, they just wilt so easy.
Do you have to use that root
The
stimulator?
rooting powder,
Yeah.
if a plant doesn't have any bark and never gets any bark, I've had just as much success without rooting powder as with. So any plant that never gets bark, easy peasy, you know, no problem. A plant that does get bark, but is green when you take a cutting from it, you probably will have better, much better success. But you know, give it a try. You know, just don't think if you fail, oh, well, you know,
Yeah.
I did it wrong.
Right.
You know, what you say is, oh, it was not very likely to happen anyway because of the physiology of the plant.
Yeah.
You know, so just don't blame yourself if
Right.
you try to break the rules.
At the wrong time, at the wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I've had things, you know, that they've said, oh, it only roots from this, but I only had a certain amount of time with my class to take the cuttings, and it was scheduled in for this and this, and we took a bunch of cuttings, and some of them rooted, you know, but it's just more likely. And sometimes books will tell you that, rooted 100% from softwood cuttings, rooted 2% from hardwood cuttings. And that's why I like the Durr book, because it really lines it out, you know, for so many plants.
Would you say the name of that book was?
Michael Durr, Plant Propagation,
Let me just put that in.
D-I-R-R.
Please.
Yep.
Give me a moment, I gotta.
He also does incredible plant ID books if you're into like nursery plants and that sort of thing.
Michael Durr. D-U-R, you said?
D-I-R-R.
D-I-R.
Yeah.
Michael Durr. And the name of the book?
Plant propagation, I believe, or propagation of, it could be propagation of woody perennials. Maybe, I'll post it on the Facebook site if you can't find it.
Okay, that works. Yeah.
Okay, so you're gonna take these cuttings, right? So now that we know a bit about rooting hormones, and now that we know about a little bit about, you know, why you use different rooting hormones, the second step is to reduce the size of this cutting, because it might seem very tempting. I get a bigger plant sooner if I stick a bigger cutting. But that is not true. The plant will have a harder time because it's trying to maintain all these tissues as well as root. So actually the smaller
Let me
cutting,
up the brightness that you can see it. This one?
that's the, yeah, that's it.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that's it. So you want to recut it because of a couple of different things. One, if you took this and stuck it in here, if a cutting moves around too much in the container, what will happen is it'll develop what's called callus, but it's very, very, very slow to root. And so the longer it takes, again, we're in the business of getting as much money out of a square area in as little time as possible, right? And so if you've got a cutting that takes 6 months to root, it's going to be less profitable than a cutting that takes a month to root. So you want that cutting to root. And if it flops around, it will callus, so that cambium layer that's in the stem will produce lots of meristematic tissue. It'll make this big ball of meristematic tissue on the end. But for some reason that I don't quite know all the details about, it will send those hormonal signals to start to make roots. So it's going to take a long time to point of sale, which is not what you want, right? You want short time to point of sale. You want to make your money and run. So the next thing that you want to do is make this cutting smaller. And what I'll do is I'll actually fill one of these.
You need some water too?
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we can water this.
Can I kind of zoom in on what you're doing with the little video here?
Yeah, I'll get closer to it. So what we're going to want to do is we are going to want to cut close to a node. And in this case, again, we're going to remove it initially above a node.
Oh,
And you can just water that container.
I'm scared it's gonna at least blow it away.
Very good.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go. But then, remember, we've cut above that node, so it's less likely that the stuff's going to be translocated all the way down this stem. So we're going to actually cut this cutting at an angle right below a leaf node, because that's where those little packets of hormones are. Now, shockingly enough, we're going to remove many of the leaves. No, it's not, because it's much better for the plant. Because what will happen is all these leaves will lose moisture.
Mm-hmm.
The little stomata underneath will just
It's too many
lose moisture.
Too many leaves for that thing to support it.
It can't support all these leaves. So we really want to remove everything but 1 or 2 leaves. So this will be our cutting.
There's nothing that those little leaves that you took off can do but
Now, in some cases, like with some houseplants that are very herbaceous anyway, or some perennial plants are very herbaceous anyway, even the leaves will root.
yeah.
But the leaves of plants that eventually develop bark generally don't root, that I know of.
Jade, isn't it? Jade gets bark and they're
Yeah, that's a succulent, so it's a little bit different again. Yeah, and the jade doesn't get bark until it's really, really big, like really thick bark. It's still fairly herbaceous because it's so succulent. And really, now that I've made this cutting this small, quite frankly, this depth of container is probably too big. Because you also want the cutting to go as low into the container as possible so that it will perceive the heat that you hopefully will have in the heat mat underneath it. Yeah. There. So we take this little cutting, and this is quite a green cutting. So you never want to dip this cutting into this container. for a couple of different reasons. Maybe this had some kind of disease.
And you don't want to transfer it to.
You don't want to transfer it. Also, this cutting is wet. And you stick it in here and it gets it wet and then it, you know, spoils it. So we just put a little bit down. Rooting powder only, that's way too much, but we could probably use more with some of the other cuttings. Rooting powder only lasts a year to be really effectively. So, you know, you might see a big container and be tempted to buy a big container, but unless you're really doing a lot, just get a little container, because if you're not going to use it up in a year, then it's just going to be wasted. You're going to be using it and it's not going to be effective, right? So then you want to poke holes in where you're going to stick these cuttings. Then you want to just dip it and tap the excess off, because again, we just want it as a kick start. We don't want to apply too much.
And you're dipping just the end, or do you hit like a node?
With a soft cutting, I just do it at the end.
All right.
With something that has bark, what I'll do is I'll actually take a knife and I'll strip some of the bark off, because that exposes more cambium, so there's more places for the roots to emerge. The roots only will emerge in the cambium. So with a harder to root cutting, it's called wounding, and you do strip some of the bark off, and that wound is also rolled in the rooting powder. Why I've made the hole is because you don't want to scrape that little bit of rooting powder off either.
Yeah.
So by sticking it in the hole, that maintains most of the rooting powder, and then you can kind of firm it up around the cutting so that it doesn't flip-flop around. And there we are. We've got our cutting. So we have one PRS cutting. It is beautiful. The thing you really need to remember with the aftercare here is don't be afraid to check for roots.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. Because what will happen with this is that the first thing that will happen is that cambial layer will produce lots of meristematic cells. It'll actually form a little ball at the end. So long before the roots come out, that thing, when you go to tug on it, it's going to give you some resistance. So you can tell. And if you pull it out and there's, you know, usually the tissue forms a little ball. It's usually white or tan, some kind of light neutral color. And once you get callus, once you get that meristematic tissue forming at the end and forming that little ball, chances are 98% that it's going to root, that it's going to continue on to rooting. So it's a good thing to know. And even when you see those first, it's a fascinating process to watch. And so when you see the first little roots coming out, they are so tough. They're not like the roots that you see in water. And that's why the water roots have to rebuild into stronger roots to get through soil. Water roots are not effective in living in soil. And so basically what will happen if you root in water and then put it in soil, all those roots will die and the other roots have to grow again. So better off to just do it straight in the soil. It's a whole different kind of, but you'll see it. The little root will come out and it looks like tough as anything, right? When you pull it out, like, I'm gonna grow! And then, yeah, you're not gonna just jam it back in. You're gonna make a hole big enough for that little tiny root to go back in and then settle the soil around it, you know, when you put it back in. So it's more important that you put it back in gently, but pulling it, because the roots start out growing down, pulling it is kind of with the grain, right? Because you're pulling it up, it's not gonna, if the roots were like this, and you were pulling it up, then yeah, you might break it, but the roots are gonna grow down. So check. And why is it important to check? Because if you have 4 cuttings sitting here, and one of them maybe doesn't take because of whatever reason, you know, some parts of the plant are not as strong as other parts of the plant. Maybe the part that was sitting in the sun developed more carbohydrates, so it got it through the rooting process better. And so one of them might not take, one of them might rot. Maybe it just happened to get contaminated by something as you were doing it, or whatever the reason, or maybe it had more disease spores on it when you took the cutting, or, you know, it's not always operator error. There's lots of variables here. So, but the trouble is, once it gets established in that one cutting, that disease can more easily, because the disease organisms grow and multiply, it can more easily overwhelm healthy tissue and the healthy microbes that are in the other thing. So that's why you want to lift these cuttings in check, and if there is one, if you pull it out, and if it just looks dry, just like you've already, you know, just like when you first put it in, then it's okay. Just stick it back in. If it has callus, stick it back in. But if you pick it up and the tip is mushy and smells bad and, you know, just kind of mushy tissue is generally a sign of bacterial rot. So if it's got anything like that, you want to get it out of there as soon as possible. And so that's why you want to check on a regular basis to see if this is happening. So that's our PRS cutting. And now, generally, again, you want these cuttings to be as small as reasonably possible. I have a bit of a rule, but it doesn't always work.
It's good.
We're still counting, so.
It's nice to get a cutting that's 3 nodes big. But it's nice. That's nice. Doesn't always happen, but it's nice. And many plants will oblige that. But if you've got nodes that are very, very close together, well, sometimes that cutting is just going to be too small to be even practically handled. And conversely, sometimes you get cuttings like maybe even these viburnum are kind of big, that if you
Get close to.
took a 3-node cutting, you know, let's break this off to start with because that's the flower. And yes, breaking is actually more effective than cutting when you are removing leaves or flowers, because what there is there's what's called a line of abscission. That's like a dotted line of cells. So it's like perforations where the plant would normally shed that leaf anyway. So by just pulling the leaf off and being careful, but pulling the leaf off, quite often it'll break right in the right place. It takes a little feel of it.
Leave much leaf residue on it, leaf or stem leaf residue. I mean, sometimes you take it and you damage the node or leave like too much leaf on it.
Yeah, if you're cutting it, quite often you can cut in the wrong place. It's hard to cut it close enough. But if you're breaking it, sometimes you might strip a little off the stem if you're not really careful. It does take a gentle hand and it does take some practice.
And are you pulling that in a downward kind
Yeah.
of a... Yeah.
Sometimes you have to jiggle it to see which way it'll go, up or down, right? Or sometimes it has a combination of both kind of thing. Now this one is giving me a hard time, so.
Do you even just cut that as opposed to, or is
Can't get it close enough by cutting. Can't get in there close enough. But still will break pretty clean. So with this one, a 3-node cutting is, so 1 node, right? Let's remove this completely. So that's 1 node, the space between those 2 nodes. This is the 2nd node. And if we did a 3rd node, that'd be a pretty big cutting, right? And there's some that, like butterfly bush, if you're familiar with it, The internodes are even bigger, so the nodes are like one here, and one here. Well, you're not going to do a 3-node cutting on that one, right? Always size your containers according to the size of your cuttings. So this is a 1, 1, 2, 3 node cutting. I'm going to recut this one here.
And you're cutting just below the node.
And I'm going to cut just below the node on an angle. And then this one is fairly green as well. So I'm going to use the same rooting powder. And because this one's a little bigger, I'm going to put it in this one. Firm up the soil. And that's where viburnum
And
cutting.
it's important to keep the leaves off the soil, is that correct? Like,
Sorry?
the leaves, keep the leaves off the soil so that they.
That's better. It's better to keep the leaves off the soil. It's also better to keep, like if you have a lot of these with leaves in them, the leaf, do another one to show you.
I've changed my stance on raising blueberries. I would like to raise blueberries. If I can do this, that'd be alright.
Well, you can do this and raise blueberries. You can propagate
I
blueberries.
can start them. I want to make a strain of blueberry that doesn't get mummyberry. That's my plan.
There we go.
I'm a little obsessed with mummyberries.
There is a definite need for that.
The teacher blueberries is super
Yeah.
And it makes these little tiny offshoots that look like big.
It shrivels up the berry.
Yeah. And it's fun.
So here's your other cutting. So say, I cut it on an angle. If you look carefully, you can see, I'll cut another one to show you. You can see the cambium layer is a little green circle there. So I'll cut another one after I stick this one to show you. Put it in powder again. Now, if I was going to put this in here, make this hole, you would not want to put it like this. This leaf is covering the tip of this. So, for some reason that I don't understand, it would be better off if this sleeve wasn't covering the other tip. So you do have to be mindful of that, especially like these leaves are very stiff, so they're less likely to kind of flop around. But when you get a plant that you're propagating that has really floppy leaves, sometimes they move around a little bit more, and then if it covers the tip, it's less likely to root. Okay, so that's 2 of these viburnum. Yep, viburnum data. Now, would you guys like to do some cuttings, sticks and cuttings?